We're next going to talk about the future of farming, which looks radically different from the way that farming has looked in the past. Vertical farming, genetic engineering, and precision agriculture are just some of the tools that will feed a growing global population. And the goal is that it will use less land, fewer resources, and do all that in the face of climate change. So to share thoughts on how to do this, we're going to have a discussion with Cameron Clayton, Klaus Kuntz, David Rosenberg, facilitated by Fortune's own Beth Coet. But first, we will have a look at some insights from Refinitiv, our partner on Farming for Tomorrow.
Welcome, thank you. So as we just saw in this video, agriculture has an extremely daunting task ahead, right? We have to feed more people using fewer resources and do it all in the face of climate change. So let's start with this question of, is this even possible? So Klaus, maybe you could touch on that. Is preservation possible at the same time as we increase production?
Thanks for that question, and it's not only possible, we have to make it possible. It's an obligation. The first step is it requires, I think, a change of mindset in many industries in the entire food sector, including ours. I mean, what we intend in Bayer, and this is really a massive change to prior times, is that these sustainability parameters become essential decision parameters in any product development step. So it's not a disconnect between business and sustainability, it's the same thing. And to make that clear, we have elaborated a couple of commitments to empower smallholders. So it's not only on soybean and corn, it's on smallholder farms as well. 100 million smallholders by 2030 to succeed. To reduce greenhouse gas emissions on farmers' fields significantly and to reduce the environmental impact in agriculture. And already to say that agriculture has an environmental impact is the first step to make it better. How do we get there? I think we have a whole toolbox of technologies. Some work in some crops, others work in other crops. And precision application for sure is very important. New breeding technologies, biotechnology, but not only GMO, CRISPR-Cas, all these new technologies, they have a huge potential to improve. Biological control, but let me say that here because that's something I really want to say after the impressions I got in the last 2 days. For me, chemistry remains part of the solution. I saw a little bit of demonization of chemistry. 30 years ago, chemistry was the promise for the future. Today, it seems the biggest threat. I think we need to go back to science and look at properties. So I don't believe that something which is synthesized in a lab is naturally, it's automatically bad. It depends on the properties.
So I want to go back to something you said here. So part of the model, though, seems to be selling less of some of the stuff you make. Yes. So that seems like a pretty big change in mindset at the company. I mean, are people receptive to that idea?
Yes. That's very nice to see because I believe the understanding that we really have a problem with biodiversity. This is spreading. Right. So, and then if you change that direction, there's an increasing number of people who feel we are doing the right thing, not only for our company, but for the world. And all this has to go in a much more inclusive way than it happened in the past. So agreeing on an agricultural model ideally has all the stakeholders on the table, because then it's sustainable, if it's accepted.
Right. So David, let's move on to you for a second, because AeroFarms is really, I mean, you are super precise in your agriculture. Tell us a little bit about how the model works here.
So at AeroFarms, we're a vertical farming company. We define vertical farming as layer upon layer of growing. We grow plants in warehouses without sun, without soil, without pesticides, giving each plant, and looking at the plants, we've grown about 750 varieties of plants, giving them a specific spectrum at a specific intensity, frequency that they want, specific nutrients, micronutrients, airflow, CO2, O2. How do we optimize the environmental conditions? So we have one side that looks at what a plant wants. What's the specification of a plant? Nutrients, micronutrient spectrum, minerals, elements, airflow, CO2, all those items. And then another side that figures out how to deliver those environmental conditions. And it could be delivered by changing a thermostat. It could be delivered by changing direction of airflow, fan speed. It could be delivered by changing water temperature, humidity, pH. There are all these different environmental factors. Sometimes genetics, looking at genetic solutions, looking at chemical solutions, whatever it is to optimize plant growth. So ultimately, the customer has great testing plans locally. So it's about local food production. Okay. And ultimately also to do more with less. So constantly using filtration. How do we use less water to grow a plant? How do we use less minerals, elements, less energy, all of those?
So let's talk about the model for a second. You know, I think a lot of startups in the space have struggled to make it work. And I think you yourself have said you think 90% of indoor farm companies will go bankrupt within 3 years. So A, why won't you? And B, why is it so hard to make this the model, the finances work?
So at the end of the day, for one to be successful as a farmer, one has to price the product that's competitive with the field or with greenhouses. There's the customer, even if it's a better quality plant, there's only so much elasticity. In the US, it's about 20% to sell at a premium. So one has to get the CapEx and the OpEx down. And it's an industry where the devil's in the details, the pennies matter. So being really careful about where the opportunity to lower capital costs, lower operating costs, in a way to provide a good product for the customer. And there are elements that don't scale in an intuitive way. So if I could grow a plant in a farm the size of this platform, it's different from growing a plant in a farm the size of this room, and it's different from growing a plant the size of this whole hotel. So how those details evolve and expand, there's a lot of opportunity to lose money in sanitation and growing good quality. So at AeroFarms, it starts with good quality, then it starts with volumes, and then then it goes to yields. So if we get the yields right, then we know we're hitting our cost points. But there's no point in hitting the cost unless you have quality. So it starts with quality and then going to the others.
So where have you been able to take most of the cost out at this point?
Certainly on the energy side. So the biggest cost of goods sold is the energy. What's the right spectrum at the right intensity, the right frequency to optimize photosynthesis, and when that light is being applied. And then it's the utilization. So how do you utilize, if you're going in a farm 100 different plants and they have different maturities, different growth cycles, different environmental wants, it gets complicated when you're measuring three-dimensionally in a room and making sure all the crops are being seeded, germinated, grown, harvested in a sequence where you're utilizing a huge plant factory. So there's opportunities lots of places, and certainly doing it all at a lower cost.
Okay, so this is when you can control all the factors. Let's talk about what happens when you can't control all the factors. So, you had told me that weather variability cost the global economy $600 billion in the last 3 years, and yet it's something we don't really talk about. Why is that? Are we just resigned to the fact that we can't really do anything about this?
Well, I think you have to think about, it's really a big data problem, right? And so our company, the weather company, as part of IBM, we're about mapping the atmosphere. So basically from sea level for 62 miles up, we're trying to map everything that's happening in the entire planet. The challenge is every one of you this morning when you woke up, before you even got out of bed, your brain had made a whole series of decisions about what to wear, what mood you felt like you were in, a whole bunch of environmental factors. The human brain's an incredible sort of computer for making environmental-based decisions. That subconscious decision-making is actually the biggest obstacle, though, we see in business, and why there's close to a little over $500 billion going to waste, is because people aren't taking proactive action about their weather strategy. And that impacts no industry more than agriculture and farming. And farmers have always, tracked the weather and its impacts. But now with huge volumes of data increasing, we see the average farm having 500,000 data points generated every day. The challenge is, what do you do with that data? How do you make better decisions? Who's making those decisions? We've decided that we needed to create an electronic field record for every field in the world, and then out of that electronic field record, work with farmers using artificial intelligence to make a prescription for that field. So how much fertilizer, how much pesticide, what type of pesticide. And so just like with Aero Farms, we've had to build an AI model for corn, a different one for barley, a different one for wheat. For all the different crops, have a specific AI model that we've built to take all this data and help farmers make better decisions, which ultimately helps improve the economics. And changing the economics is how we're going to feed the next sort of 2 billion people on the planet.
So let's talk about this, because it came up a lot this morning that we had a session on this about food. It was quite lively and very provocative, but one of the concepts that came up was, this is great, we have all this technology, but unless we really change the basic economics for farmers, is this conversation even relevant? So I don't know if Klaus, maybe you want to talk about that, or Cameron.
No, and that's a good point, because farmers will only adopt these solutions if they make sense for them from an economic perspective. I think they will make sense because they will enable them to approach a new business model where we even have the opportunity to guarantee, for example, yields. They will appreciate that they can treat their land in an even better way, because the soil is their capital, it's their most important capital they have. So I think it's a win-win for everybody, and it has to be developed in a win-win for everybody. Building on that, I think that technology adoption only works if the trust foundation is laid in the society. So I think a conversation we must have from the early beginning. We have seen that in biotechnology. We will see that for the digital applications as well, is how is the data used?
Yeah.
And who has access? And what is the ownership question? And these type of questions, I think, are very important. For me, it's an open conversation. Maybe there will be different approaches in different geographies to that question, but it's very important that this data is seen as a trust instrument and not as the opposite.
Yeah.
Yes, I would add, if you think about climate change, almost every country in the world but one has agreed on a set of standards for climate. It's taken a long time, but we've finally got a sort of a consensus opinion on climate change. I believe we need to get to that same level of standards around agriculture and the data types, and also bringing government and the private sector together to develop those standards. Because there's sort of a wave of nationalism spreading around the world where regulations are developed locally, standards are developed locally. But if we really want to change the outcome for the entire planet, and have 2 billion more people fed, we have to get to an even playing field of standards, and then quality will ultimately thrive in that environment.
To build on that, I agree. It's about raising standards of performance. As we raise standards of performance, then the farmers know what targets to go after and are rewarded or hurt if they don't meet those standards. So if it's water, using less water, then the good actors have an incentive, and innovation has an incentive to solve for water. If it's pesticide use, if you use too much pesticides or are able to grow plants without pesticides, the customer should be able to see that, and that's another way of rewarding good actors and getting innovators to innovate without pesticides or different kinds of pesticides or amount of pesticides. So there's a lot of different ways standards come in, and it gets people working holistically, industries together to meet targets, and gets the customers ultimately a better product.
Please, Klaus, go ahead.
Maybe on the same matters, also for regulation, I believe regulation should not stand in the way of innovation, but at the same time, too low regulation is equally bad. So I think we also should all strive for really a good level of regulation, which ensures, for example, safe use of tools. And from my perspective, it's an absolute disadvantage in a local economy if there's no reasonable regulation in place.
Okay. So, David, let me ask you the data question, because you were telling me you just have access to an unbelievable amount of data. I mean, you know so much about every individual plant. How do you manage that? I mean, are you moving to a different model here, or are you lost in all this information?
I'll start off. It started off with us out of necessity, where the plants, when we started growing, sometimes the plants wouldn't work well. So we started tracking data for data's sake, appreciating that we'll start seeing patterns. And then it evolved to more sensors and more sensors. And because it's fully controlled agriculture, we have thousands of sensors and are able to track a tremendous amount of information. And just as an example of how we treat that, most farmers, you put in fertilizer as you seed, and then in leafy greens, you water, and you just have one shot of fertilizer. We'll adjust the fertilizers, and we'll track magnesium, iron, zinc, all the minerals and elements, and we'll make adjustments. We're working on a system now. By the end of the year, we'll make adjustments every 15 minutes. So this plant needs more zinc, this plant needs more iron. And there's some good elements, aspects of data where it helps us be better farmers. At the same time, we realize tracking data for data's sake, it's just too expensive to host that data. So we've started changing the dialogue from big data to smart data, and to understand what's really meaningful. And it's important historically to be able to go back so we can see patterns and inform us of better farmers. Look at the data, look at the set of standards, and it does certainly influence. We have data that goes to our R&D team, data that goes to our operations team, to quality assurance, obviously to sales, marketing, and so forth. And what's mission critical, what's stored on the edge, the cloud, in the core, and what goes to quality assurance like minute one, what goes to sales and marketing maybe hours later. And just managing it is a beast in and of itself. And the software, both of managing the data and separating the data, as well as capturing it, is immense, and there's a lot of opportunity. The last point is, I've learned how ignorant we are on what makes a plant grow. And there's so much opportunity to really understand plant biology and optimize it. And I'm excited for the future. I'm an optimist where through the data collection, the patterns will be realized and more solutions will come to the table.
So, I just got a new customer here that I need to go give a sales pitch to. But that's exactly the problems that we're trying to solve for farmers, large or small,
right,
in the food chain. And most of them do have too much data,
yeah,
and they don't know how to make good decisions with that data. And so when you've got too much data, and the data's only going to grow, we're only going to get more,
right,
not going to get less. And so that's when you need to bring artificial intelligence and machine learning to bear that will change the outcome. And we've seen it happen in many farms around the world already.
So you said something pretty surprising, that we are very ignorant about how to make plants grow. I mean, we've been doing this for a really long time. Why have we not made progress here?
Well, I mean, I would say agriculture as an industry has been underinvested in for decades and for centuries. In Silicon Valley, it wasn't the problem that money went to solve, and there's tremendous inefficiencies along the whole value chain. And where there are inefficiencies, there are a lot of opportunities. I'd say one reason that the money hasn't flowed to innovative solutions is there's limits on how much you could price up. And it's not like software where it scales in a very easy way. You sometimes have to deal with behavioral change with an industry that doesn't embrace technology willingly. So it could be long sales processes and so forth. For one of the positive parts about the industry is it's not going anywhere. In fact, the problems with given population growth are increasing. So the industry is a good sector, and now you're starting to see a lot more investment in the space. And regarding the comment about we don't understand plants, it's a lot of our mental concepts of how a plant works has to do with what's in the field or what's grown outside. But a plant doesn't necessarily, for example, need 10 hours of darkness. Maybe some plants need 1 hour of a diurnal cycle or darkness. Maybe it needs 10 minutes. Maybe it needs nothing. Maybe it needs 5 hours. And when you could really play with those environmental factors, when you could play with what happens if you bring the temperature to a certain level at a certain point in its maturation, and what a plant wants in an earlier stage of a maturation is different from a later stage, when you could play with all of these tools in a big data way, in a building the size, in a farm the size of this building, it really becomes illuminating of how plants react in different ways. And there are ways you could influence taste, texture, nutritional density, shelf life, color, all of these factors that typically farmers are just hoping for yield. And there's a lot more to celebrate, not just diversity, but quality.
Klaus, go ahead.
Yeah, on the same tracks, and a bit elucidative how difficult sometimes it is to drive these insights forward is the discussion around genome editing in Europe, which I personally believe is an incredible opportunity to drive progress. It's immediately linked to GMO technology, but it's not necessarily GMO technology. It's kind of a transition from conventional breeding to GMO. And we should have really an open conversation to see the opportunities lying there, to understand the plants in every single detail, and to make very targeted improvements on that plant in a very short period of time. In the past, breeding took ages. It took decades to come to a new variety. And for me, it's important that we improve on this. But inside our industry also, the knowledge for these opportunities is not so widespread. Just as an example, I will do the same with you. I did an exercise in a panel where I asked the audience, please raise your hand, everybody who knows Norman Borlaug. Yeah, that's interesting because Norman Borlaug was such an important person in our industry. He actually received the Nobel Prize for Peace for finding varieties of wheat which would be much more stable and not fall in a storm. And actually, he was one of the people who are assigned to have rescued most people's life ever. And that's why he received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1970. He's from our sector, and nobody knows him.
Right. I guess it goes back to what you were saying before about there's this demonization piece of it, which is, you're suggesting, is hindering some of the advancements we could be making here.
Absolutely.
Let's see if we have any questions in the audience. Anybody? Okay, well, let's continue on this thought here of innovation, because this morning in our breakfast, Pat Brown said that agriculture had been an innovation wasteland. And I want to get a sense from you, is that true? And if that's the case, why? Why has agriculture been so slow to adopt some of these tools that we've seen just kind of take off in other sectors? Maybe Cameron, you could start with that one.
So I don't think it's an innovation wasteland at all. I think the last decade has shown tremendous innovation in the sector. I think though, we are not learning the lessons of other industries going through transformation. So we're making similar mistakes that have been made in other transformational change. And right now I would say
Wait, just pause for a second and give me an example of that.
Well, I would say like cloud computing when it first started, it was all about the shiny new companies, and we jumped from shiny new innovation that was peripherally interesting. But the thing that was really fundamentally interesting happened sort of at a very basic change that occurred. And I think it's the same with agriculture. There's lots of shiny, new, amazing things that are happening, and they're great, and we should talk about them. But we need a fundamental change in the economics of farming. That's what's going to make sustainable food production for 10 billion people a reality. And so what I mean by that is, how do you, whether you're a large farmer or a small farmer, how do you actually get a loan? How do you get a loan? It's almost impossible for small farmers in every country in the world to get loans, mostly because governments subsidize many of those farmers, which counterintuitively means the financial industry doesn't find it appealing because there's no liquidity on the back end of the financial instruments. And so we have to work at that sort of, it's not sexy necessarily or cool, but we have to work at this foundational level of the economics of farming to get liquidity into farming. That will ultimately drive yield. Small farmers are fantastic at managing their cost structure. Large farmers have room for improvement typically, but the small farmers have great yield. But the economics aren't there. And I think we're getting distracted with the shiny, cool new things versus these sort of fundamental changes we need to see happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
To build on that, it's an industry where the prisoner's dilemma really comes into effect. A lot of farmers don't have a branded product, so if they're a good actor or a not good actor, the not good actor often has a competitive advantage because they don't have some of the cost add-ons that a good actor has. So coming with a technological improvement doesn't always find its way into the economics, because a lot of the benefits of like waste reduction, pollution, water reduction don't get into the calculus of the cost of goods sold because of sometimes incentives and the not intended impact of incentives that cloud what the true economic costs of growing are.
Great, Klaus, go ahead.
Yeah, and I also think, even though that's not a scientific topic, we need to find better ways to bridge between what people want and what farmers need.
Right.
I think there's a huge gap in understanding. A very traditional way is that we try to educate people. I don't believe that anybody wants to be educated by me. I think we need to find different approaches to bridge this gap of societal expectations and farmers' needs. Because, as you say, there's a lot of innovation out there. We just didn't manage to make it visible.
Right.
There's also a big, we've talked a lot over time about the digital divide. There's a divide of access to information, right? And so I'll use weather as an example. But if you're trying to get weather information in Africa to grow your crops or your produce in Africa, you have weather information that's essentially about 40-year-old technology, right? Whereas in North America and even here in Yunnan, like, you can get weather information at a hyperlocal granular level. You can get it 4 inches down under the soil, 8 inches above the soil, at a 1 kilometer grid over the entire place. So there's this meritocracy and democratization of data that also is a big deal. And so we're launching a new product called Graph. It's a new global weather model that's essentially going to enable farmers in Kenya to have the same sort of weather information that a farmer in Kansas would have. And that will make a big difference to the whole world and bring everybody up to sort of an even playing field.
All right, well, that's a very positive note to end what could be a rather depressing topic. So thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it.